from your vantage point. Is Ukraine losing this war?
They're not losing, but they're not winning. I think that's the challenge, is that the war is stalemated.
It's become increasingly clear that Ukraine is, simply put, running out of men and running out of the capabilities to pursue a really long-term war.
They are not, for the moment, rushing to take back Kursk at any cost.
No, they do not. But this is not an on-off switch. And I think a lot of people would expect something to change immediately. And I don't think that was ever to be expected. The reality is that Ukraine has, by its action, stretched the front line. It's forced Russia to reconsider the disposition of its forces.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. I took a break for part of the summer. I hope you had some relaxation too. Time to get on with the discussion. Ukraine. Here's the question. Is Ukraine losing? It seems like it could be. It seems like Ukraine is unable to push Russia out of occupied areas in the east, even with Ukraine's bold land grab inside Russia in Kursk. And the bigger question, what's at stake? Does Russia have bigger plans that go beyond Ukraine? I mean, a lot of people say it does. Do we buy the argument? Democracy and freedom are on the line in Europe and beyond. Well, different guests this week, different perspectives and views. And that's the backstory on Ukraine. Malcolm Davis is with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He's an expert on future warfare and military technology, and just not future warfare, but existing warfare. And there is a lot of it, Malcolm. And I welcome you back to the podcast. Can you give me a reality check from your vantage point? Is Ukraine losing this war?
They're not losing, but they're not winning. I think that's the challenge, is that the war is stalemated. Now, Ukraine have made this very audacious and daring offensive into the Kursk region, and they're holding on to most of the territory that they've captured. And clearly, that's humiliated Putin. It's also made it more complicated for the Russians to reinforce their military forces inside Ukraine in the Donetsk and Luhansk areas of the Donbass. So the Ukrainians have actually done a rather bold and audacious move that seems to have paid off for the moment. But at the same time, the Russians in the Donetsk region are making advances towards key towns such as Pokrovsk, which are important from a logistics perspective. So, and the Ukrainians are basically withdrawing from that area. So it's possible that as the Ukrainians take the territory in Kursk, the Russians are advancing in Donetsk. And so it really is a case of stalemate rather than the Ukrainians winning or the Russians winning. It's not over yet. And I suspect this war will go well into 2025 and maybe even beyond 2025.
Is Kursk a fool's errand of sorts? They're pulling forces from the Eastern Front, and as you've noted, the Russians continue to kind of bulldoze forward. Every few days, another village falls, or they advance somewhere. It's not rapid, but it is consistent. Why spend your forces up in Kursk where the Ukrainians are probably going to get pushed out of there eventually anyway?
Well, it's uncertain as to whether the Ukrainians will be forced out. If the Ukrainians can find defensible lines and hold that territory, that gives them a valuable negotiating chip in any future ceasefire.
I would jump in and argue with you and say absolutely they're going to be pushed out of there because this is Russian territory. But 3 weeks in, I would be blushing saying, well, maybe you're right.
Well, I think that is the surprise for everyone, is that they've managed to hold on as long as they can. And from what I understand, they are still pushing forward in some areas. But I think that holding on to that territory is important if they can, because it gives them that valuable negotiating chip in any future ceasefire negotiations. Secondly, the more territory they can hold, the more difficult it is for the Russians to reinforce their forces in the Donbass area and Donetsk and Luhansk. And over time, that then does have a deleterious effect on Russian combat capability as the Russians begin to run low on supplies and of fuel and munitions and essentially food and other things like that. So it evens out in probably 2025. Things will slow down in the sort of late spring, the late autumn, early winter. It's sort of like getting my seasons right in the different hemispheres. And I think that we'll see what happens in the new year. And I think also the Russians...
I've interrupted you, and I'm not going to do it again. I apologize. But what do you mean it's going to even out? I'm a bit turned upside down with time as well now. You're saying that the Russians are running out, and Ukraine... If right now the Russians, if right now Ukraine is on a back foot, you think in 2025 they won't be?
I think that if Western military assistance continues to flow to Ukraine, then Ukraine can hang on. They can't necessarily win, but they can continue to blunt Russian advances. The Russians are making advances in some areas, but at great cost. Now, the Russians have a superior military industrial capacity in terms of turning out munitions and so forth.
For sure.
So the key thing that will emerge in 2025 is, firstly, does that Western military assistance dry up? If you have a change of administration in the US after the presidential election and Trump gets back in, then I think it is almost certain that US military assistance will dry up, in which case Europe will be hard-pressed to fill the void left by the US. But at the same time, the Russians have got to step up their military production, and they may have to think about a mobilization. And that will be politically unpopular for Putin if he does go down the path of mobilization. So it really does then get into a situation of who can acquire or produce the most munitions and who can maintain their hold on territory into 2025.
I mean, I've traveled across Russia. I've seen the big old Soviet Union. Your head spins around when you enter some of these cities and you realize all they ever did was produce munitions. All they ever did was produce warplanes or tanks or chemical weapons or biological weapons. I mean, Ronald Reagan's evil empire. And the fact is that we're pouring more and more money into Ukraine, and it doesn't seem to have changed the battlefield.
Well, I think we have an obligation to do so, because let's remember the facts here. It was Russia that launched this war. They were the aggressors. They were the ones that invaded Ukraine, which is a sovereign nation state and a Western democracy. They did so because they sought to essentially wipe Ukraine off the face of the map. They sought territorial expansion. That was against every single rule in the rules-based international order. And if we hadn't have poured that money into Ukraine, if we hadn't have supported Ukraine, then that would have sent a terrible precedent, not just in terms of European security, but in terms of, for example, how China thinks about Taiwan. So I think we had an obligation.
They'll keep going. And I tend to think, just like you do, that Putin will not be finished or satisfied.
Absolutely. He's got much bigger plans than Ukraine. And I think that if he does win in Ukraine in, say, late 25 or early 26, then he'll be emboldened to rebuild military capacity as fast as possible and then confront NATO directly in the latter half of this decade. And once again, that would be coordinated with China in a move against Taiwan. So I do think that we have an obligation to defend Ukraine and to ensure that it wins. The challenge for us in doing so is threading that strategic needle so that Ukraine wins, and we, at the same time, deter Putin from reaching for tactical nuclear weapons. Because if Putin uses tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, NATO are then obligated to respond at a conventional level, and you end up in an escalatory cycle, which we're all trying to avoid.
It seems escalatory right now to me.
It's escalatory, but it's the Russians that are escalating. Okay, what we're trying to avoid is that really big escalation of a Russian attack on a NATO state conventionally, or a Russian use of tactical nuclear weapons. For example, if Russia did use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine and we didn't respond, then that would embolden Putin even more to use more tactical nuclear weapons, and it would send the message not only to the Russians but also to the Chinese, to the North Koreans, to the Iranians, that use of tactical nuclear weapons is okay. So that would change the game for international security in a major way. So we're between the rock and a hard place there if we're presented with that scenario. And that's why I'm saying we do have to step up in terms of our deterrence posture to make sure that the Russians do not use tactical nuclear weapons under any circumstances.
And yet you heard Zelensky announce this week that they have new weapons. They appear to have the reporting from bloggers and the press inside Ukraine is it sounds like they have ballistic missiles that can hit Moscow. Can you imagine what is going to happen? And frankly, I can't, because I don't know where it's going to go after that. If a ballistic missile hits the Kremlin or starts exploding on some target inside Moscow. There have been drone attacks before, but they weren't very significant. But a ballistic missile actually hits someone, a building, a government building, kills someone. I mean, where does that go after that?
I mean, that is a big step. But, you know, to put that into context, the Russians just launched a massive attack with large numbers of ballistic missiles on Kyiv. So I do think that the Ukrainians are justified in developing this capability and using it. And I do think they're justified in using it given that the Biden administration is quite illogically refusing to let them use ATACMS against targets deep inside Russia. So, you know, yes, the Ukrainians do have this new ballistic missile. They will certainly use it, I'm sure. And, you know, a ballistic missile will have much more payload capacity than a drone. So it could create a lot more damage. And then it's really up to the Russians on how they respond to that. And they've got a number of choices. They can launch massive attacks on Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities like they've been doing in the last few days, try to inflict as much damage as possible. Or they can reach for the tactical nukes. And if they reach for the tactical nukes, then they know that NATO must respond conventionally, and then they're in an entirely new war. And are they prepared to go down that path, knowing that, you know, the risk of escalation into a strategic nuclear exchange is very real? I'm not sure. So I think that, you know, I once again support Ukraine in launching attacks against Russia, including with this ballistic missile on Moscow if necessary. But NATO has to do its bit and step up and deter Russia from using tactical nuclear weapons in response.
I mean, that's the big gamble. And I was going to ask you, why is the Biden administration, do you think, still stalling on supplying the necessary weapons, or at least lifting the restrictions on the weapons that they have already supplied to the Ukrainians to allow them to hit these air bases or these S-300s or you know, any of the aircraft that are launching these glide bombs? I mean, there was another 90 drone attacks overnight. The night before, there were another 90 some odd, or almost 100, you know, rocket and drone attacks. 200 earlier in the week. I mean, the number of attacks on Ukraine this week alone has been head spinning.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the Biden administration is terrified of the prospect of escalation to use of nuclear weapons or the prospect of Russia retaliating directly against NATO. That's the two scenarios that keeps Biden and his national security advisor and his Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense awake at night. Because what they don't want to do is get sucked into a war directly with Russia, because they know where that leads. But at the same time, if they don't allow Ukraine to win and Russia ultimately prevails and wins in, say, late 25 or 26, that's exactly where they end up in the end, because Russia will then threaten NATO. So, you know, Biden does need to understand that, you know, it's important for Ukraine to win, because if Ukraine wins at the same time as NATO firmly and effectively deters Russia from using nuclear weapons, then it's checkmate for Russia, and we defeat that threat once and for all. Obviously, coming out of that scenario, the US and NATO have to stand firm along their eastern frontier indefinitely. They face that Russian threat so long as the Putin regime is in power. The challenge there, of course, is they also face a threat in the Indo-Pacific with China against Taiwan. And that demands that the US and its allies, both in Europe and also in the Indo-Pacific, step up, increase defense spending, and go to a pre-war period mindset and paradigm in terms of boosting defense industrial capacity so that they're ready to deter, and if that deterrence fails, they're ready to fight. And I'm not convinced at this point in time that Western democracies have got themselves into that right frame of mind yet.
Is that, and then the last question to you, and I appreciate your time, is that because not everybody buys this argument that this is a larger war? It is not the Russia-Ukraine war, that this is a real struggle. I don't want to say democracies against autocracies, but it is, the European liberal order, the Western liberal order, fighting back Putin, who has essentially declared war on them. And not everybody buys that larger global argument that Putin's just going to keep coming. A lot of people think it could just stop in Ukraine and push for a ceasefire, try to do something that they did like with the two Koreas, and wait for Putin to push on. He's getting older, and why bring this to a full confrontation right now?
Well, firstly, they should be thinking in terms of a global confrontation between authoritarian states and liberal democracies, because that's exactly what we're seeing. What you are seeing is countries like China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran working together as authoritarian states to confront Western democracies, to end a rules-based international order that is led by Western democracies, to end democracy as a form of governance, and to create an authoritarian world order for the 21st century. That's exactly what is happening. We're in this global conflict now. It's very different from the last global conflict, be it the Cold War or the Second World War, but nevertheless, the potential for that global conflict to end up in a hot global war, a World War III, if you like, is quite real. I think second point is that many people are terrified of the prospect of nuclear war or escalation in that sense, and so they don't want to take the hard decisions to stand firm, and they don't believe yet, in spite of Putin invading Ukraine in 2022 and Xi Jinping continually threatening Taiwan, they don't believe that authoritarian states actually will use force to achieve their geopolitical aims. And I think that we've been lulled into this lazy, strategic timidity since the end of the Cold War, where we are not prepared to confront the possibility of world war or major power war or nuclear war. And we need to get our heads out of that sort of strategic timidity mindset and into recognizing that that post-Cold War interregnum that existed from 1991 through to about probably 2014 is over. And we need to start thinking about an entirely new, much more dangerous strategic environment where we are once again confronted by authoritarian states in the same way that we were in the late 1930s. And Hal Brands has written some excellent analysis in this regard, where he directly compares the events now that are occurring this year and in previous years with the late 1930s, and the parallels are quite apt. So I do think it's really important for Western democracies to realize the fight that we're in, to recognize that it simply won't go away, that even if Putin eventually dies, that the person replaces him will be far worse, because believe me, there are no pro-Western reformers in the queue to basically lead Russia. And that Xi Jinping is determined to impose unification on Taiwan, even through the use of force, because he's got so much politically invested in that goal. So, this is the fight that we're in, and we have to be ready for it. And I think that we have little choice.
I hope you're wrong, Malcolm Davis, but I think you're probably right. And so I appreciate your perspective, and it's late at night in Australia, and thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Always happy to help out.
Anthony Constantini is a conservative writer for the American Conservative, a conservative magazine. He received a degree in arms control and strategic studies. Anthony, nice to meet you.
Thank you very much. I just to clarify, I'm a contributor for American Conservative. I'm not formally employed by them.
Cool. So let's just talk about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine right now. More drones overnight, close to 100. The night before, There were a combination of rockets and drones, and the night before that, and the night before that. There are hundreds this week. It seems like it is escalating right now, not de-escalating in any way.
Yeah, no, I would say that that's certainly true. I think that a couple weeks ago you saw a decent amount of even very, very pro Ukrainian voices in the West starting to say, maybe we need to have some more negotiations, a little bit more. And I think that there was an argument that the war could have been maybe drawing to some sort of long-term pause. But I think that recent events have kind of shunted that off to the side for the time being.
You've written that you don't think Ukraine can win in the East, and that Russia is not going to be pushed out of the areas it's invaded and annexed. Is that fair?
That's a fair way to phrase what I've said. Yes.
Why do you think so?
I think it's just a matter of what Ukraine can bring to bring to the table versus what Russia can. In the very beginning of the war, I wrote that Ukraine should not jump to negotiations, that they should have pushed as hard as they could, especially after their fantastic Kharkiv counteroffensive in late 2022. But it's become increasingly clear that Ukraine is, simply put, running out of men and running out of the capabilities to pursue a really long-term war, which would result in them getting back Crimea, getting back the East. And whereas Russia simply has a large amount of individuals it can just kind of throw into the fire, can go into these rural villages where people have no real political power outside of Moscow, outside of St. Petersburg, and just pull as many people as they need. They have the money, and more than anything else, they have the time.
So what would you say about the wisdom of Zelensky and his generals launching this offensive inside Russia in Kursk?
I think it was a mistake. I understand where they're coming from in that they needed to shut down the conversation that was growing in the West that was trying to push Ukraine towards negotiations. But the problem is whenever you engage in some sort of military action, especially like this, there has to be a clear end goal. And to me, the end goals either don't seem to exist or don't seem feasible. The Ukrainian government has put forward that they're going to use Kursk as a bargaining chip, which seems reasonable on the surface. But when you look at the fact that, you had Prigozhin get into Moscow Oblast just last year, and Putin was relatively unaffected. The idea that he's going to run screaming to the negotiating table saying, fine, take whatever you want, give me Kursk back. I just find it unrealistic. I lived in Voronezh for about a year, which is a city 500 kilometers south of Moscow.
I've been there.
They had a joke there. And they had a joke there, which is
there were a lot of American students there, by the way, right?
Yeah, there was a language program there. And they had this joke for decades, which was, they're all in the Kremlin gathered together, and they say, okay, the time for talk has passed. We need to bomb the West. And so one of them says, well, let's bomb London. And somebody says, oh no, my money's there. One of them says, let's just carpet bomb France. And they say, oh, well, I have a villa there. And they keep going on and on and on. And then somebody says, well, what about Voronezh? And no one in the Kremlin has anything to do with Voronezh, so they bomb there. And in the same way, Kursk is not some city that is crucially important to Putin's heart. He's not going to just do everything he can to get this back, especially when the biggest area they've taken so far is, I think, a town with about 6,000 inhabitants. And so what it seems to me is that Putin is annoyed, obviously, and probably embarrassed, because this is objectively embarrassing, but he'll throw people at it. He'll wait. Eventually, Ukraine will get pushed out of that. And then at the end of this incursion, they won't have taken any of Russia's land. Russia will have slowly chipped away in the south, as they're currently doing. And Ukraine will be worse off. They'll have less men. They'll have less armaments. And potentially, if the United States government has changed next year, they may have a much less supportive American government. I can't see a way that this will work out in a positive way for Ukraine.
So let's talk about that possible government that is led by, conservatives and President Trump, possibly. He's saying he wants to end the war right away, and he wants to stop spending money, and he wants to end American support. Europe may continue to fight on and in their supply to Ukraine, and I don't know how that will work out and whether they've got the necessary muscle. A lot of people don't think that they'll be able to keep Ukraine going for very long without American support. But what is the consensus, if you can even speak from that perspective, in conservative circles right now on long term, do you just give Putin what he wanted? You let him bite off a huge piece of Ukraine in exchange for what? And what price does he pay? And what is the deterrent in the future for him not going after Lithuania or Estonia or the Baltics or Poland and on and on?
I think that, I mean, first, as you indicated, it is tough to say that there's one clear consensus right now in conservative policy circles. I think that if Harris were to win, there are enough Republican senators who would vote to pass, more Ukraine aid. The Speaker of the House, should he be Speaker next year, he's already made clear he would continue to support aid. But that said, there is a kind of loose consensus forming that the post-Cold War order that the United States did uphold is something that no longer needs to be upheld. And I think that when people, and it's a fair question when people say, well, what price should Putin pay? What happens if Lithuania, Estonia come next? Is a lot of, especially when it comes to national conservatives, who are starkly different from their what can be called fusionist conservatives, or kind of Bush conservative predecessors, is that they don't really see it through that lens. Putin is not that popular in the Republican Party. When you look at polls, he's almost as unpopular as he is in the Democrats. He has, I think the last poll I saw showed his approval rating something like 7% in the Republican Party and 6% for the Democrats.
Putin.
Yeah,
They actually poll and ask people how popular they think.
The amount of polls that people ask Americans to give their approval.
Why on earth would we be polling people, asking Americans, what do they think of the Russian leader? I mean, is he in some popularity contest inside the Republican Party?
Well, it's a fair question. I mean, those numbers came from Pew, I believe. I could double check that. It was Pew or Gallup. But they usually ask the questions like that pretty regularly, at least in the U.S. But this is all to say that at the same time, it's not necessarily a respect for a newfound respect for Russia that is causing them to say we don't really. I don't want to say that they don't care, but
you might be right if you did say that. You might be right.
There's more of a sense of, I mean, and I don't mean to just simply restate, Trump slogans, but a sense of putting whatever would result in helping America first. And so what that would mean is, it would be sad, and I'm speaking from their perspective, from the perspective of what would likely be an incoming administration. It would be sad if the Baltics were attacked, but the Baltics are not our responsibility. The Baltics is Europe's responsibility and the EU's. A lot of them, I mean, some of them, and I wouldn't say that they're all defining themselves as national conservatives, for example, but say take Elbridge Colby, who's likely going to be Trump's national security advisor. He's made this point again and again that Europe has a fantastic weapons industry. They have 400 and something like 50 million people in the European Union. They have, with France, nuclear weapons. If you include the United Kingdom, 2 nuclear weapon states. There's this sense that the United States simply does not need to take care of, for example, countries like Eastern Europe, that Europe can take care of Eastern Europe. And so it's not necessarily a question of, well, should Putin pay this price, at least coming from this perspective of a new Republican administration, but why would we bother making him pay one when he didn't really go after us? He went after an order that we no longer care about, is the thinking. If they wanted to uphold this order, then sure, that kind of conversation would be held. How do we make him pay for this? But they don't. They don't really care about upholding that world order anymore. They think that it was detrimental to American interests.
May as well give China Taiwan then.
Well, that's the thing. The argument is that you have to.
May as well give North Korea South Korea.
Well, if you uphold American interests, then you don't.
But I'm saying if you follow.
No, sure. I. But the thing is, if you uphold American interests, then you don't have to have a kind of one size fits all there. You can say, well, it would help America's interests to keep China from breaking out of the first island chain, so we need to keep them out of Taiwan. But it doesn't really matter to us if Russia's territory moves a bit into Ukraine's. At least that's where this thinking comes from. That kind of one size fits all, you absolutely cannot do this anywhere on the planet, has kind of fallen by the wayside. And a lot of that is due to the fact that we never really upheld that thinking. at the same time, the Bush administration was pushing the Bush doctrine of democratization. They were, best buddies with Saudi Arabia, who executes people for being gay. And there was a sense of, look, if we're going to be hypocritical anyway, why don't we at least be hypocritical in U.S. interests? And so that's kind of what's really driven the party in that direction.
Wow. I have lots of questions, but when I hear people, say that there's no need to uphold the post-Cold War or post-Cold War thinking anymore, and just give Russia the Baltics or whatever they want. I shudder, but it's interesting. And you think that is a majority in the Trump circle in the Republican Party? I mean, it's certainly not in the Senate, I think, but
no, it's definitely not a majority of the Senate Republican caucus. And to be clear, I'm not saying that they're saying give it to Russia, but what they're saying is Europe has the capability to defend itself, and it clearly just does not want to. And that's something I would, myself agree with, is that I think Europe has gotten very, very comfortable spending a lot of money on social services, but then having the Americans kind of come and spend money on defense. And what I think a lot of European leaders are worried about in the back of their heads is that if America leaves, they're going to have to either increase taxes on an already overtaxed, tax base, or cut social services. And I think that is panicking them. But you're already seeing this happen, for example, in Germany, where you have the government effectively saying, we're not going to give Ukraine any more money because we don't have it. Which obviously they do, but they just don't want to spend it. And so there is this frustration that Europe is simply really just refusing to pick up the ball. I mean, you had, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, Brussels tried to make this big deal about a new defense spending fund, which sounded great until you saw that it was $1.5 billion, which for a military defense spending fund is kind of a drop in the bucket. I think had Europe been less resistant to Barack Obama's push to raise defense spending 10 years ago, I don't think you would have this kind of, call it distaste coming from the Republican Party toward Europe now. But they were very resistant with Barack Obama saying, hey, could you please do this? They were extremely resistant with Trump much more aggressively saying, you need to do this.
You're talking about the 2.5% of GDP for NATO membership.
Yeah, I'd say that way back. And even when Obama was trying to push them to sanction.
I mean, by the way, these are trade partners. These are cultural partners. These are close allies, right?
I mean, I would agree.
You didn't step up with the money. See you later. It's not a Trump negotiating position, although a lot of people think that's what it was. You're saying there's actually a real core belief that, to hell with Europe.
I think the problem is, had Europe, for example, over the last 30 years, and nobody expected them to do this, the United States did not ask them to do this, and perhaps that's America's mistake. If Europe had said, we are part of the West, we are all the West, and we love where we came from, we love our cultural traditions, that would be one thing. But I think that Republicans, especially today, see a Europe that is not saying that, but is still expecting America to uphold its end of this bargain. And I think, I can speak, from personal experience, the amount of times I've heard, you completely selfish Americans, you don't want to help us, but then also, haha, you don't spend any money on your own healthcare. Wow, this is just so pathetic. And every time America says, we are going to take some troops out and we do want to spend money on our healthcare, it gets to, selfish again. And so it kind of goes in the circle. And I think that circle has eventually built up and it's just kind of frustrated enough Republicans at this point. It's not a majority in the Senate. Mm-hmm. I think if Donald Trump was president, he would likely be able to sustain a veto. If he vetoes some large Ukraine aid package. But if he's not president, those aid packages are likely still going to keep rolling.
Anthony Constantini, nice to meet you, and pleasure to get some of your perspective.
Likewise.
It's a bit jarring to hear somebody say it, but it's not the first time I've read it or understood that there are people that hold those views. So, and they are probably gaining some ground within the Republican Party as this war plays out in Ukraine, and people say, okay, the counteroffensive didn't work. We're pumping billions in there. At what point do we stop? At what point do we get the fighting stopped and focus more on American needs back home? And that debate's happening a lot, and it's naive to pretend it isn't. So thank you so much.
No, yeah, likewise.
Hans Peter Midttun is a former Norwegian Navy commander, and he was posted to NATO, and among others, he was in Ukraine as a naval attache for Norway, and he regularly has been back in Kiev. In fact, he was there just a couple of weeks ago. Welcome, Pete.
Thank you, Dana. It's a pleasure meeting you.
Look, you've written a pretty compelling piece, and that's why I wanted to interview you on why the restrictions on Ukraine need to be lifted. It's really part of a growing chorus from some very credible people on why the West has to allow Ukraine to hit further into Russia with Western weapons than it is now. Can we just talk about that? Because in this week, when Ukraine has been pummeled with hundreds of drones and missiles and bombs, it is especially, poignant right now.
Well, absolutely, and I've been, I have to say, I've been arguing in favor of this for quite a long time. While the limitations to the use of Western use weapons is more something of a newer date, from my perspective, this has been a part of a border confrontation for such a long time. This is not only a question about Ukraine's right to defend itself according to international law, it is also about its ability to defend us, Europe, and the West. And I find it very odd that we, by supporting Ukraine, simultaneously impose restrictions to what it can and cannot do according to international law. I mean, UN Charter allows Ukraine to defend itself, but for that there is no question whatsoever. But by imposing limitations to what targets, legal targets, Ukraine can do, we sort of put infringements on how we interpret international law. And I find it's...
Do you really? Because I don't, if I'm able to jump in here, because we have... we've spent generations trying to avoid war with Russia. We in the Soviet Union before that, we have spent incredible amounts of efforts in arms control agreements on steering clear of a conflict that could draw the world into a nuclear exchange. So why would it surprise you then that the U.S. administration and others are so hesitant to allow weapons that they're providing to Ukraine to be used in an offensive manner inside Russian territory? And I know what I'm telling you is not news to you, and I'm sure you've given it lots of thought.
Well, it takes you straight down to this discussion about escalation or the fear of escalation. Mm-hmm. And there's several layers to that. And one of them is that one of the most important battle space on this war, and there's 6 domains. The most important of those domains is the fight in the cognitive space, this fight for the mind. And Russia has used these 10.5 years to impose a fear in the West, being afraid of exactly what you say, this fear of escalation, fear of this turning into a border confrontation and a nuclear war.
End of days, Armageddon, absolutely.
Sure. But the point is that the fear of escalation it defies logic in a sense. First of all, we have to recognize the fact that irrespective of what we have done, irrespective of our policy, Russia has chosen still to turn peace into war. They've chosen to escalate. We have to recognize that at the moment, or for actually last decade, Russia has controlled or managed escalation while we have kept safe distance. The only way you can actually manage escalation is that you self-escalate to de-escalate. And we haven't done that. But still, that has not stopped Russia from doing what it has done, starting a full-scale war in Ukraine, or in Europe, if you like. The other part of it is And it goes a little bit to the heart of this discussion about the fight and the battle on the cognitive space. But many doesn't really understand Russia. They see diplomatic measures, negotiations, political talks as a sign of weakness. They only accept or respond to strength. And what we fear, what we fear will provoke them is actually the opposite. They are provoked by our weakness, by the fact that we have not responded to their provocation for more than 17 years, since 2007. And lastly, if there was something to this aspect of escalation, well, Ukraine has crossed the red lines so many times that we should have seen that escalation a long time ago. And even we, the West, have crossed that escalation task a long time ago.
It's not static, is it? I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's not static, because within Russia, you have growing outrage and pressures on the so-called Putin inner circle to take more serious action. Whether that be the use of a tactical nuclear weapon, whether that be attacking the transportation lines that are moving Western equipment into Ukraine from places like Poland. And so it's not that, there were red lines, we crossed the red lines, and that's that. We called them on their bluff, and now let Ukraine do whatever the hell they want. I mean, in fact, there's still a danger there, and those red lines are not static.
No, they're not static, but we also have to put into consideration the realities on the battlefield, if you like. The fight in the battlefield, which consists of nuclear threats or threat of escalation or World War III or whatever we call it, it has no match. It doesn't link up to the realities. Firstly, it doesn't match the Russian doctrines. It does not match their military capabilities and their ability to explore these opportunities. It does not match the fallout of such an action. Only such a thing like the threat of mutual destruction is a part of the thing they need to assess before they actually go to this step of escalating. They need to consider their relationship to their international partners and so forth. I mean, I know it's not full, but I'm saying there's more arguments in this favor than in favor of escalation. The main point is still, though, is irrespective of what we have done, Russia has chosen to escalate, and it still escalates. And the only way you can get into that OODA loop, or in the decision loop, is to yourself be willing to take that risk.
All right, so is the Kursk invasion by Ukraine a necessary escalation? Is it a wise thing that Zelensky has ordered his army to do?
For me, I've written an article called on escalation and the red lines. And to me, this is just another clear proof that the Russian threat of escalation does not, the red lines does not exist as such. I think it's smart because it shows to the Russian public that the war is coming home. Putin cannot protect Russia from the fallout of the war. It undermines his regime. But it's also important for us because it's so much easier to support one on the battlefield who succeeds and not, withdrawing as we have,
No. I'm puzzled by it because at the same time that Zelensky has done this, the Russians are advancing in the east, and it looks like some of those battle lines are not collapsing, but they're certainly being pushed back. Ukraine is losing ground, so they're siphoning away some of their muscle from the eastern front line to go into Kursk, hoping to somehow influence Russian public opinion. But we're not seeing the Russians take the bait, really, are we? They continue to push in the east and taking more villages and more settlements, and they are not, for the moment, rushing to take back Kursk at any cost.
No, they do not. But this is not an on-off switch, and I think a lot of people would expect something to change immediately, and I don't think that was ever to be expected. The reality is that Ukraine has, by its action, stretch the front line. It's forced Russia to reconsider the disposition of its forces. It forces Russia to build up, relocate forces, not only in Kursk, but along the whole international border to Ukraine.
Belgorod as well.
So on. So the long-term effect of this will be far-reaching. So I agree that Russia is sort of digging in, they're trying their best. We've seen a higher number of clashes the last week than we've seen in ages. But that's, as autumn is setting in and things will eventually slap down, it's just a matter of time. Ukraine has forced Russia to use its reserves in Kursk. So its ability to stay in the tempo, that will be a fall just in next upcoming weeks.
You think sorry, just to clarify, you believe not the Ukraine tempo, but the Russian tempo will falter, you believe?
It will falter in the weeks to come, and no doubt about it.
Can there's a bit of a mirage here, right? In the daily news cycle, where we don't tend to explain things very well because we're running from story to story to, headline to headline, and where we say, well, a bunch more missiles were fired overnight, a bunch more areas were hit by those missiles, another electrical grid, a building, 4 Ukrainians died, and I don't mean to minimize this, but 5 Ukrainians, 3 Ukrainians, people get lost in that. How would you characterize what's happened in this past week? I mean, it is really unprecedented to have 200 rockets and missiles and these glide bombs launched in one night and then 90 the next night. I mean, Russia's really turning up the heat here.
Yes, I know. I mean, we have a short memory span, I think. When this full-scale war started 2.5 years ago, Russia launched between 200 and 300 missiles a day. So this is not extraordinary. It's extraordinary because we haven't seen it for 2.5 years, if you like. But this happened before. And it's you might argue that it's triggered by the Kursk incursion because it needs to demonstrate that it still has strength, still the ability to hit.
Yep.
But we will also see, that we have seen from the statistics, that Russia has not the ability to sustain this kind of attack. It will falter, even at this stage. But it needs to demonstrate to the Russian public that they still have this ability to hurt Ukraine.
How are they hurting them? I mean, as a military person, you know very well, if I shoot at you, if I fire I think somebody used the analogy yesterday, if I fire the arrow, you're not just going to intercept the arrow, you're coming after the archer. So why is Ukraine unable? What does the archer look like? Where are they? And why is Ukraine unable to stop it?
Well, we take it straight back, in a sense, to the discussion about the Western imposed limitations. But it also a discussion about what kind of support have we provided Ukraine. So just to provide you a bit of statistics, since the full-scale war started, Russia has launched something reaching about 9,700 missiles at Ukraine, about 14,200 drones. It's an immense number. On top of that, they are increased, last year especially, they increased the use of guided glide bombs against Ukraine. Today, there are about 3,500 glide bombs dropped every month.
These are massive. These are not just 500-pound bombs, which are scary enough. These are massive.
It is absolutely massive. And what we're seeing is these bombs alone, they are, together with artillery and amidst, they are razing Ukrainian cities and villages to the ground. It's massive destructions. But we've also seen that from the drones and missiles, that they have caused massive destruction by themselves. Ukraine has lost like half of its energy generation capacity, 9 gigawatt lost this year by Russian strikes. And we're at a stage where one fears that some region of Ukraine will be, people cannot live there during the frost period when you reach minus 20 to 30 degrees in the worst case. So the damage to Ukraine and the destruction of Ukraine is massive. I mean, we're talking about like nearly $500 billion in the cost of rebuilding Ukraine after the war. Now, the reason they are not able to stop this is that most of the majority of these missiles, for like 45, or at least close to 45% of the missiles, they're launched within reach of Western provided weapons. We're talking about Iskander, the North Korean ballistic missiles. We're also talking about.
Sorry, you're saying within reach or beyond?
Within reach, yeah. They reach outside the range of the HIMARS, but inside the range of systems like Snowstorm or the Attache. We're talking about more than 4,000 missiles launched, where they have managed to down about 81 of them. Now, you just have to taste that.
It's minuscule.
One missile shot down,
Intercept
more than 4,000.
Yeah, that's minuscule numbers, right?
Incredible. And the reason for that is there's only one set of air defense system capable of stopping them today, and that's Patriot. Ukraine has urgently and repeatedly asked for up to 25 systems, batteries. They have reduced the numbers, recognizing that they will not be given 25, asked for at least a minimum 7 to 11, and we're not even close to that numbers. And the consequence is, as we see, Ukrainian cities and villages and infrastructure being devastated. So we don't not only provide them with the systems they need to defend themselves, but we don't allow them to hit the launches before the missiles are launched. And I find that highly immoral.
So the Archer looks like what? These are air bases that are flying aircraft. These are artillery and rocket launch platforms. These are ships at sea in the Black Sea. These are also air launch bombers that are coming long range in further away from the Ukrainian border, and they're able to launch without even entering or coming close to Ukrainian airspace.
True. So there's a wide range of them, but if you see the statistics, the one they are struggling with, that is the one launched close to the border. Now, they have, from the ballistic missiles, they're downing about 4.5% of them. On the missiles, which have a ballistic trajectory, like S-300, S-400, used in secondary mode, they're downing 0.6%, hardly nothing.
And they are close to the Ukrainian border, and if the gloves were taken off and the U.S. administration and others said, okay, you can fire into Russia, which they have done on a limited basis, like some 19% of the area. But if they give Ukraine the full right to go after those S-300s, for example, would Ukraine be able to hit them?
Well, it all goes down to intelligence, of course, the real-time situational awareness. But Ukraine has a far better intelligence and situational awareness than Russia have. Not only because of its own capabilities, but also because of the support from the West, of course. And we've seen that in other strikes, that they've only been enabled by a fantastic intelligence. They reach fine targets. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, because they are mobile. You need to sort of find them on a way. You need to track them, and you need to hit them while they are setting up to launch. And that's a very, very small time window given. At least you have that opportunity. You threaten Russian capabilities, and you force Russia to rethink their strategy. We've seen that works already. I mean, there's 16 airfields within range of Attache. And Russia has moved their airplanes, the fighter jets, from them and further afield to avoid something Russia thought would be in force already, long time ago, the permission to strike them. So they already launched some of their capabilities further afield.
Yeah.
But we should not lose track of all those other targets left behind, which is all within range of Western provided weapons.
Let me ask you two things, and because I know time is short. The President of Ukraine, Zelensky, said yesterday that, they have a new weapon. There's a lot of speculation about what he's talking about. Probably some kind of longer range missile, high speed, ballistic, that could hit Moscow. Do you think that if that's in the cards, does that take us to a new level of conflict?
I think it's been in the card for a long time, to be honest. I mean, we have seen Ukraine striking targets at a range more than 1,800 kilometers. They have slowly, over the last year and a half, expanded their capability to attack targets in the depth. What Zelensky mentioned just days ago was two things. First is a new missile slant drone with fueled by turbine jets with a far longer range, other capabilities, better capabilities than the rather simple drones that are sending in these days. And the second system is ballistics one. They just yesterday, I think, announced that they have launched or successfully completed the development of a new ballistic missile, which means it will have an even greater impact on Russia. A ballistic trajectory is so much more difficult to stop than anything else. So yes, we see Ukraine expanding its ability to wage war in Russia, and denying Russia the ability to continue its war in Ukraine, and irrespective of Western support. And I think it's a result of the lack of Western support. Ukraine, anyone who knows Ukraine knows that they will never, ever give up in the face of Russian repercussion. They're fighting for their existence, and they will use whatever means available for them to defeat Russia.
Do you think all this talk and negotiation, there's a lot of politics in there, but the idea that Ukraine is suddenly going to sit down at the table with Russia and allow Russia to, bite off a chunk of the East and in return for what, I don't know, maybe demilitarization or promises that Ukraine won't join NATO, or that Zelensky's going to give, that Zelensky would give that kind of ground, or the Ukrainian public would probably not allow him to after this much time, or do you think they're getting tired?
To be honest, there's no doubt that Ukraine start being tired. It's just to start with that, because 2.5 years of war had a huge impact. And you notice, I've seen that depending on at what time of the year I'm there, you can see that people are getting tired. But there's no way Ukraine will give away any bit of territory. The reason for that is they recognize that this war is existential for Russia. They know that Russia, having done what it has done, having played its card, it's demonstrated for the world their imperial ambitions, if you like. Yeah. They know that if they accept negotiation, accept a peace agreement, they know that it will be temporary. They have made more than 200 talks and 220 ceasefires during the 8 years leading up to the full-scale war.
From 2014.
Yeah, from 14 to 22. And they only saw that turning into a full-scale war because Russia started the war in 14. They intend to see through. They intend to defeat Ukraine. And they intend to defeat Ukraine to do the next step.
Okay, so the next step then, and that's my final question to you, and I might have a supplementary in there, and that is that you've written articles and criticism saying don't call it the Russia-Ukraine war. That is that badly bends reality. Why do you say that?
No, I'm said a little bit frustrated by the term, to be honest. I think it's highly misleading. We sort of belittle a war that is so much bigger. We discussed that even when I was defense attaché with my colleagues at the time. We recognized that based on Russian doctrines, its statements, its narrative, its disinformation, its actions, this is a much broader war. And you don't have to take my word for it. I mean, the European Union, the EU Parliament in September 2021 put out an extremely well-prepared document discussing the European Union's policy towards Russia. And they listed a long list of Russian aggression towards the European Union and its member states, and it concluded that Russia is waging a hybrid war against the European Union and its member states. It's documented in its action across the United States and Europe, everything from sabotage to liquidations to terror. There's a long list of Russian aggression already taking place. This is already a much broader confrontation. And what's happening in the West is exactly what happened in Ukraine from 2014 to 22. It's exactly the same war. And it's worth mentioning, and actually it's crucial to recognize that Russia has not defined Ukraine as its enemy. It's actually explicitly said that Ukraine is not its enemy. It has said the Western democracies are just that. So it reflects in its doctrine, it's in its actions, in its statements. Everything is done is related to NATO, the US, and Europe. So, but we have belittled the war because it's so much easier to discuss and find solutions to a small war than what in reality is.
Absolutely.
In sense, it's a war for dummies. That's
why Trump says he can end it within a week of his presidency if he's back in the White House.
It has had that, and it's absolutely misleading. But that said, I'm not too impressed by how President Biden goes about solving this war either. There's one key message I think people need to understand. That was, if you go back to 24th of February and the time after, you heard all heads of state saying that this is a Russia-Ukraine war. Ukraine is not a member of NATO and therefore is not eligible for NATO collective defense. All perfectly true. The only problem with this, there's none of them mention NATO's core essential task number 2. Core essential task number 2, that is crisis management. Crisis management is, to use a picture, is when you see there's a fire in your neighbor's house and you decide to go help to put it out before it increases in intensity and spreads to you. That's crisis management. And NATO studied the concept until June 2022, after the full-scale war started, said, in case of war or conflicts which threaten the security of the alliance will use a mix of political and military tools to stop it. That war we're seeing today is exactly that war. But no one, NATO, nor Biden, nor any heads of states, talk about that core essential task, crisis management.
But they do, and will say that they have spent endless energy and resources supporting the freedom of Ukraine and stopping Russia from advancing further and bolstering NATO forces in the Baltics and elsewhere, ready if Russia wants to take another step. But whether they've done that effectively or not, there's a lot of people would debate that.
Well, it's not even open to debate, to be honest, because before Russia decided to do the full-scale invasion, 24th of February 22, they did 17 years of violation of the international law. They did 17 years of testing our resolve. And they concluded that we were not up to doing what was our strategic ambition, to do crisis management. Before they attacked, they must have considered the opportunity that NATO would intervene, because that was the ambition of NATO. They concluded that NATO would not do that. And by doing that, they actually proven that NATO deterrence do not work. We're fighting an uphill battle to convince Russia that when we say that we intend to defend every inch of NATO territory, that they believe us. At the moment, I don't think they believe us, because actions talks otherwise.
That's a dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. It's extremely dangerous.
Hans Midttun, former Norwegian Navy commander. I think once a commander, always a commander. Former naval attaché for Norway to, among other places, including NATO and Ukraine. Thank you so much for your thoughts and time, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great talking to you, Dan.
And that's our backstory for this week. Please share the podcast. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.